On the morning of November 17, 1961, the humid air over the Arafura Sea reached a stagnant 32 degrees Celsius with 90% humidity. Michael Rockefeller, age 23, stood aboard a primitive catamaran. Two 40-foot native prahus lashed together with rattan and rusted iron wire. The vessel was a logistical compromise, powered by an 18-horsepower Johnson Seahorse outboard motor. This specific model, a staple of early 1960s maritime exploration, utilized a two-cylinder reciprocating engine design that was notoriously susceptible to the silt-heavy discharge of the Islandan River. When the cooling intake became clogged with volcanic sediment and saline debris, the internal temperature of the motor spiked, seizing the piston rings. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic slap of the tide against the hollowed-out logs. The geography of the Asmat coast is a labyrinth of mudbanks and mangrove swamps where the tides can fluctuate by as much as 4 to 5 meters. At the time of the motor's failure, the catamaran was approximately 5 kilometers from the shore, drifting toward the southwest. Michael's companion was René Wassing, a 34-year-old Dutch government anthropologist assigned to oversee the expedition. Wassing was a product of the rigorous Dutch colonial administrative school, trained to analyze tribal structures but unprepared for the mechanical failures of the mid-century. Two local guides, Leo and Simon, had already abandoned the craft, swimming for help hours earlier. They carried no signaling equipment. The expedition relied on a primitive 1961 survival kit, a few tins of iron ration biscuits, a compass, and a sense of invulnerability inherited from the Rockefeller name. By 8 a.m., the craft had drifted further into the Arafura Sea, a body of water known for its treacherous southwest monsoon currents. Michael, a 1960 Harvard graduate with a degree in history and economics, calculated his odds. He was an experienced swimmer, but he was clad in heavy cotton khaki shorts and a nylon undershirt, fabrics that become leaden when saturated. Around his waist, he lashed two empty 18-liter red plastic jerry cans. In 1961, these polyethylene containers were cutting-edge industrial products, designed for fuel transport, but now repurposed as crude flotation devices. Michael looked at Wassing and stated his intention. "I think I can make it." He dove. The water temperature was a deceptive 28 degrees, warm enough to mask the onset of hypothermia during a prolonged immersion. Beneath the surface lay a biological minefield. The Arafura Sea is home to the Crocodilus porosus, the saltwater crocodile, which can reach lengths of 6 meters and exert a bite force of 3,700 pounds per square inch. Alongside them were tiger sharks and the highly venomous sea snake, Enhydrina schistosa. Michael began a steady breaststroke, his eyes fixed on the distant low-lying green line of the mangroves. He was swimming against a rip tide that moved at approximately 2 knots. To any observer, he was a speck of wealth and privilege being dissolved by the raw mechanics of the natural world. The political context of November 1961 added a layer of terminal isolation. The territory, then known as Netherlands New Guinea, was the flashpoint of a Cold War proxy conflict. Indonesian President Sukarno had launched Operation Trikora, a military campaign to seize the region from Dutch control. Soviet-made Badger bombers were already being stationed in nearby bases. The Dutch administration was underfunded and retreating. This meant that the search and rescue infrastructure Michael expected simply did not exist. There were no helicopters on standby, no radar coverage, and no radio contact. Michael was swimming into a vacuum of power, both natural and political. As Michael drifted further from the catamaran, René Wassing watched the two red jerry cans bobbing in the gray swells until they were nothing more than pixels on a vast, unforgiving horizon. Michael believed his stamina and the buoyancy of his fuel cans would carry him to the safety of the shore. He did not realize that the coastline he was targeting was the territory of the Otjanep, a village still reeling from a colonial massacre 3 years prior. He was not swimming toward a rescue party. He was swimming into the center of a ritual debt that could only be paid in blood. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born on October 23, 1938, into a lineage that functioned as America's uncrowned royalty. He was the son of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, a man whose ambition was as vast as the oil fields that built his house. In the year of Michael's birth, the United States was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression. Yet the Rockefeller family's diversified interests in real estate, banking, and the remnants of the Standard Oil monopoly shielded them from the economic carnage. By 1960, Nelson Rockefeller's personal net worth was estimated at $200 million, a figure that, when adjusted for 2026 purchasing power, exceeds $2.1 billion. This was not merely wealth. It was a sovereign-level capital reserve that allowed the family to shape the skyline of New York and the foreign policy of the United States. The family seat was Kikwit, a sprawling 40-room Beaux-Arts mansion located in the Pocantico Hills of Westchester County. Completed in 1913, the estate was a masterpiece of architectural engineering, featuring reinforced concrete structures clad in local stone and interiors decorated with Ming Dynasty ceramics and Renaissance tapestries. The technical maintenance of Kikwit required a staff of over 100 individuals, including specialized curators for the family's private art collection. Michael grew up in an environment where the camada de etiqueta, layer of etiquette, was as rigid as the steel beams of the Rockefeller Center. Dinner was a formal affair governed by 19th century protocols, even as the world outside transitioned into the nuclear age. Michael's education followed the prescribed path of the American elite, Phillips Exeter Academy, followed by Harvard University. At Harvard, his tuition and expenses were managed through a complex network of trusts. In the late 1950s, an Ivy League education cost approximately $2,500 per year, $26,000 today. A negligible sum for a family that spent that much on a single weekend of landscaping. However, Michael's academic interests began to diverge from the family's focus on high finance and modernism. While his father championed the abstract expressionism of Jackson Pollock, Michael became obsessed with primitive art. He spent hours in the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, fascinated by the functional beauty of objects created by cultures untouched by the Industrial Revolution. In 1960, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York, a position he used as a springboard for his presidential ambitions. The political machine surrounding the family was a sophisticated logistical operation, utilizing the first generations of mainframe computers for voter data analysis. Nelson was a man of the gilded future, a builder of highways and skyscrapers. Michael, conversely, was a man of the primal past. This ideological friction was the silent engine of Michael's life. He sought a realm where the Rockefeller name carried no weight, a place where he could prove his worth through physical endurance and cultural synthesis rather than inherited dividends. The family's financial architecture was built on the ruins of Standard Oil, which the Supreme Court had ordered to be broken up in 1911 under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Ironically, the breakup made the family wealthier as the individual shares in companies like Exxon and Mobil skyrocketed. By the time Michael reached adulthood, the family office at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, known simply as Room 5600, managed a portfolio that touched every sector of the global economy. Yet for Michael, this wealth was a cage. He viewed his 1961 expedition to New Guinea not as a vacation, but as a necessary escape from a life where every outcome was predetermined by a bank balance. When Michael finally departed for the Pacific, he carried with him a Nikon f/35mm camera, the pinnacle of 1960s Japanese optics, and several crates of trade goods. He had exchanged his Brooks Brothers suits for rugged denim and heavy boots. His father, Nelson, saw the trip as a youthful rite of passage, a final adventure before Michael returned to New York to take his place in the family hierarchy. He did not realize that Michael had no intention of returning to the boardrooms of Manhattan. The heir to the Standard Oil fortune had found a new obsession. The Asmat people, a society where status was earned through the taking of heads, not the accumulation of capital. Nelson Rockefeller expected his son to bring home a collection of artifacts. He never imagined his son would become part of a collection of ghosts. By March 1961, Michael Rockefeller had distanced himself from the administrative safety of the governor's mansion to join the Harvard Peabody expedition. This was not a casual safari. It was a multidisciplinary scientific endeavor led by Robert Gardner, a filmmaker and anthropologist whose vision for ethnographic cinema would culminate in the landmark film Dead Birds. The expedition focused on the Hubula people, often referred to as the Dani, in the Baliem Valley of the New Guinea Highlands. Logistically, the operation was massive. It required the chartering of Douglas DC-3 transport aircraft, the workhorses of post-Bubuyuptrur aviation, to ferry tons of equipment from the coastal base at Hollandia, now Jayapura, into the rugged interior. A DC-3 charter in 1961 cost approximately $250 per hour, equivalent to nearly $2,700 today. The technical load included 16mm Arriflex cameras, thousands of feet of Kodachrome film stock, and Nagra 3 portable tape recorders, which were the first to provide professional-grade synchronization between sound and image in extreme environments. Michael's role was that of sound recordist and still photographer. He utilized the Nikon F, the first 35mm SLR, to be widely adopted by professional photojournalists for its modularity and durability. He documented the ritualized warfare of the Dani, where battles were fought with spears and arrows in a highly choreographed display of ancestral appeasement. However, Michael's attention began to drift toward the south, to the Casuarina coast, the ancestral home of the Asmat. The Asmat were culturally and geographically distinct from the Highlanders. While the Dani practiced agriculture, the Asmat were nomadic hunter-gatherers living in a tidal swamp of 10,000 square miles. The environment was a biological furnace, a network of mud, mangroves and sago palms where the soil was too soft to support stone, meaning every tool and weapon had to be traded for or carved from bone and wood. The Asmat were known in ethnographic circles as the headhunters, a term that carried a literal, terrifying weight. For the Asmat, the human body was a mirror of the tree. Feet were roots, the torso was the trunk, and the head was the fruit. To harvest a head was a spiritual necessity to balance the cosmos. Michael was mesmerized by this direct, visceral connection between life, death, and art. In May 1961, he made his first foray into Asmat territory. He was accompanied by Peter Matthiessen, the acclaimed novelist and naturalist who would later write The Snow Leopard. Matthiessen observed Michael's feverish energy, a Rockefeller trait applied to the acquisition of wood carvings rather than corporate shares. Michael began trading steel axes for Asmat shields. A high-quality steel axe head cost about $5 in 1961, $53 today. But to an Asmat carver who had spent his life using stone adzes and shark skin for sandpaper, it was a piece of alien technology that could reduce months of labor to days. This exchange created an immediate and dangerous economic distortion. The influx of Western steel disrupted the traditional prestige economy of the Asmat. Michael was not merely buying art. He was inadvertently devaluing the social standing of tribal elders who had earned their status through traditional labor. He moved between the villages of Agats, Amanamkai, and Otjanep, often traveling in a 40-foot dugout canoe powered by a small outboard motor. The heat was a constant 35 degrees Celsius, and the humidity hovered near 95%, causing the leather on his camera cases to grow mold within 48 hours. Despite the physical toll, Michael felt a sense of liberation. He wrote to his family that he was doing something significant, far removed from the stifling expectations of New York society. He was building a collection for the Museum of Primitive Art, an institution founded by his father in 1954 to elevate non-Western art to the same status as the European masters. The expedition's secondary characters provided a stark contrast to Michael's idealism. Robert Gardner was focused on the cinematic truth, often ignoring the human needs of the subjects for the sake of the frame. Jan Broekhuizen, a Dutch government anthropologist, served as the bridge between the colonial administration and the expedition. Broekhuizen was deeply skeptical of Michael's aggressive collecting. He understood that in the Asmat world, no transaction is ever final. Every gift creates an eternal obligation. As Michael loaded his canoes with bish poles, towering ancestral totems, he believed he was participating in a fair trade. He did not realize that in the eyes of the Asmat, He was accumulating a spiritual debt that the Western world had no currency to repay. Michael Rockefeller's approach to collecting was characterized by the same ruthless efficiency that John D. Rockefeller had applied to the petroleum industry. He did not want mere samples. He wanted the definitive archive of Asmat culture. His primary targets were the Bishi poles, massive, intricately carved monuments ranging from 4 to 6 meters in height. These poles were carved from a single nutmeg tree, Myristica, specifically chosen for its buttress roots, which were carved into a symbolic phallus known as the CB. The carving process was a ritualized event, performed only after a successful headhunting raid to commemorate the dead and release their spirits. The technical skill required to carve such a dense, moist wood using only basic metal tools was immense. The wood was treated with a mixture of lime, made from burnt seashells, charcoal, and ochre, creating a stark white, black, and red palette that Michael found aesthetically superior to any modern sculpture in Manhattan. To facilitate his empire of art, Michael established a logistical base in the village of Agates. In 1961, Agates was a colonial outpost built on stilts above the mud, consisting of a few Dutch administrative buildings, a mission, and a small infirmary. There were no roads. All transport was by water. Michael's budget for the Asmat phase of his trip was roughly $20,000, over $210,000 in 2026 value. This capital was deployed with precision. He purchased over 50 large shields, dozens of drums, and nearly a dozen bish poles. Each acquisition was documented in his field journals with the meticulousness of an auditor. He recorded the name of the carver, the village of origin, and the specific mythic figure represented. This data was intended to be the backbone of a major exhibition at the Museum of Primitive Art, which at the time occupied a townhouse on West 54th Street, a property valued then at $300,000, roughly $3.2 million today. The macro context of late 1961 was one of terminal colonial anxiety. The Dutch were preparing to leave New Guinea, and the Papuanization program was in full swing, attempting to train local leaders before the Indonesians arrived. The Dutch governor, Platel, was under immense pressure from the United Nations to decolonize. In this vacuum of authority, Michael Rockefeller was seen as a golden ghost, a figure of immense wealth and mysterious origin who appeared in villages, distributed wealth, and left with the souls of ancestors. The Dutch missionaries, particularly the Crozier Fathers, viewed Michael's activities with a mix of gratitude for his funding and dread for the cultural disruption he caused. One priest, Cornelius van Kessel, warned Michael that his presence in the Casuarina coast was stirring up old rivalries. The village of Otjanep, in particular, remained hostile toward white men following a 1958 incident where a Dutch patrol had killed several village leaders in an attempt to suppress a local war. Michael's strategy also involved a physical transformation. He abandoned the master of the universe persona of New York. He often went barefoot, his skin bronzed and scarred by insect bites and tropical infections. He ate the local diet, sago palm starch, which is 80% carbohydrate and virtually zero protein, supplemented by the occasional sago grub, the larvae of the Capricorn beetle. These grubs, while rich in fats, were a culinary challenge that Michael accepted as a badge of authenticity. He was attempting to shed his Rockefeller skin, yet he remained tethered to his heritage by his reliance on Dutch logistics and his father's checkbook. The tension between his desire for primitive immersion and his reliance on industrial technology was a flaw in his architecture of self. By November 1961, Michael had amassed a collection that would today be worth tens of millions of dollars on the international art market. His crates were being prepared for shipment on Dutch KPM line freighters, a maritime operation that required specialized crating to prevent the wood from warping during the transition from the humid tropics to the dry climate of New York. The shipping logistics alone cost $2,000, $21,000 today. He felt he had achieved his goal, but the Asmat had a different perspective. In their culture, the Bishi poles were not meant to be preserved. They were meant to be left in the sago groves to rot, their spiritual power seeping into the soil to nourish the next generation. By removing them, Michael was not saving the art. He was, in the eyes of the villagers, stealing the spiritual potency of their land. He was a man who understood the price of everything, but the value of the spiritual void he was leaving behind was a calculation he completely ignored. In the autumn of 1961, the physical and economic distance between the 75th floor of the Rockefeller Center and the mud-slicked banks of the Vriendschap River represented the greatest wealth disparity on the planet. Nelson Rockefeller's headquarters at 30 Rockefeller Plaza was a marvel of Art Deco engineering, clad in 1.2 million cubic feet of Indiana limestone. The building utilized the most advanced Otis elevator systems of the era, capable of ascending at 1,200 feet per minute, a technical feat that cost the Rockefeller family approximately $4 million in 1930s currency, equivalent to over $85 million in 2026. Inside, the climate was strictly controlled by early industrial HVAC systems, filtering out the smog of a booming New York City. The governor's office was a sanctuary of French oak paneling and original works by Fernand Léger, where the air smelled of expensive tobacco and the silent, high-frequency hum of a multi-billion-dollar political machine. Contrast this with Michael Rockefeller's residence in the Asmat region, a jus, or communal men's house. These structures were architectural masterworks of a different kind, built entirely from organic materials without a single nail. The jus was supported by primary pillars of ironwood, Insia bijuga, a timber so dense it does not float. These were sunk into 5 meters of tidal mud. The flooring consisted of split bamboo lashed with rattan fibers, creating a platform that flexed with the weight of 40 men. There were no walls, only the dense canopy of the surrounding mangroves to break the wind. While Nelson Rockefeller enjoyed a gourmet diet prepared by staff in a kitchen equipped with the latest Hobart industrial ovens, Michael consumed sago, a starchy pith extracted from the metroxylon sagu palm. The extraction process was labor-intensive. The tree was felled, the trunk split, and the pith pounded into a pulp that was then washed and strained. The resulting paste was roughly 350 calories per 100 grams, almost entirely carbohydrates, and devoid of the vitamins necessary to prevent the scurvy that plagued early explorers. The monetary contrast was even more jarring when viewed through the lens of maritime luxury. In 1960, the Rockefeller social circle was defined by vessels like the Niarchos yacht, owned by shipping magnate Stavros Niarchos. This 190-foot floating palace was valued at approximately $10 million. A figure that translates to nearly $106 million in 2026. It featured stabilized hull technology to prevent seasickness among the elite and was staffed by a crew of 30. Michael, however, navigated the Casuarina coast in a 40-foot dugout canoe he purchased for the equivalent of $35 in trade goods, $370 today. His craft was prone to swamping in the 5-meter tidal bores of the Arafura Sea. He slept on a thin woven mat vulnerable to the Anopheles mosquito, the primary vector for Plasmodium falciparum malaria. In 1961, the standard treatment was chloroquine, a drug that Michael carried in his medical kit but often forgot to take as he immersed himself in the local culture. The macroeconomic reality of 1961 New York was one of aggressive expansion. The Dow Jones Industrial Average reached a record high of 734 points that year. Nelson Rockefeller was overseeing the construction of the Empire State Plaza in Albany, a project that would eventually cost $2 billion, $21 billion today, making it the most expensive government complex in the world. Meanwhile, Michael was documenting a society that lacked a concept of currency. The Asmat practiced a gift economy where status was not measured by accumulation but by the ability to orchestrate elaborate feasts and headhunting raids. While Nelson was concerned with the gross domestic product of New York State, Michael was learning that among the Asmat, a single steel axe head was a more potent symbol of power than a $1 million stock certificate. This divergence created a profound psychological rift. Michael's letters home were increasingly detached from the concerns of his family. While his twin sister Mary was integrating into the high society circles of the East Coast, Michael was describing the exquisite textures of dried human skin on a ceremonial drum. He had rejected the glass penthouse for the mud hut, But he failed to realize that his presence in the mud was only possible because of the glass penthouse. His logistics, his cameras, and his safety net were all funded by the very oil monopoly his grandfather had built. He was a tourist of poverty, protected by a billion-dollar insurance policy he didn't believe he needed. As Nelson Rockefeller began his 1962 gubernatorial re-election campaign, spending an estimated $5 million, $53 million today, on media and grassroots organizing, his son was drifting further into the shadows of the Casuarina coast. Michael had found a world where the Rockefeller name was replaced by the title Tuan, master or outsider. He relished the anonymity, yet he used his wealth to manipulate the local art market, creating an artificial demand for sacred objects. He was a man caught between two architectures, one of steel and ambition, and one of wood and spirits. He did not yet know that the spirits of the wood were far more vengeful than the rivals he had left behind in New York. To the American public, Michael Rockefeller was the archetype of the adventurous heir. Harvard-educated, athletic, and possessed of a noble curiosity. This was the mask carefully maintained by the Rockefeller family's public relations apparatus, a system perfected by Ivy Lee, the man who had transformed the family's image from robber barons to philanthropists. In 1961, the Rockefeller brand was an asset worth billions, and Michael was its most promising ambassador. His photographs in National Geographic style, khakis, Nikon camera slung over his shoulder, a confident smile, were designed to humanize the massive wealth of the Standard Oil fortune. However, this image was a projection. On the ground in New Guinea, the mask was slipping, revealing a man who was increasingly isolated and culturally adrift. The technical reality of Michael's work relied on the Nikon F, a camera that revolutionized field anthropology. Launched in 1959, the Nikon F featured a modular design with interchangeable viewfinders and a titanium foil shutter that could withstand the 95% humidity of the tropics. A full kit in 1961, including the 50mm f1.4 lens, cost approximately $400, $4,200 today. Michael used this machine to create a barrier between himself and the ASMAT. Through the lens, the headhunters were subjects of study, not peers. Despite his efforts to go native, he remained a Tuan. The Dutch colonial administrative hierarchy categorized all Westerners this way. At the top was the resident, followed by the controleur, and then the bestuur's assistant. Michael, though a private citizen, was afforded the status of a high-ranking official because of his father's influence with the Dutch government in The Hague. The macro context of the era was the ethical policy of the Dutch colonial government, a desperate attempt to prove that they were civilizing New Guinea before the United Nations forced them to hand it over to Indonesia. This policy involved the suppression of warfare and headhunting, the very activities that gave ASMAT art its meaning. Michael arrived during a period of intense cultural trauma. In 1958, a Dutch controleur named Max Lapre had led a patrol into the village of Otjanep to stop a war. The patrol, armed with M1 Garand rifles, opened fire on the villagers, killing several high-ranking leaders. The technical superiority of the Dutch weaponry, firing 30-06 Springfield rounds capable of penetrating 2 inches of solid wood, left the ASMAT terrified and vengeful. Michael, entering this same village 3 years later, was unaware that he was viewed as a relative of the men who had murdered the village's spiritual protectors. Michael's isolation was not just cultural, it was personal. While his peers in New York were entering into strategic marriages, alliances of finance and social standing, Michael was virtually celibate in the field, his energy entirely sublimated into his collection. His primary social interactions were with men like René Wassing, the Dutch anthropologist who was essentially a paid chaperone. Wassing was a technician of human behavior, trained at the University of Leiden, the world's leading center for Indonesian studies. He viewed Michael with a mix of professional respect and private exhaustion. Wassing noted in his reports that Michael was obsessive, often ignoring safety protocols in his pursuit of rare carvings. The Rockefeller wealth had removed the word no from Michael's vocabulary. a dangerous condition in an environment governed by the unforgiving laws of the jungle. The archive curiosities of the period show the cost of this isolation. Michael's daily expenses in the field, including fuel, guides, and food, averaged $100 a day, $1,060 today. This was more than a Dutch colonial officer earned in a month. He was a walking economic anomaly. He bought so many artifacts that he caused a shortage of steel axes in the region, leading to a local inflation of trade goods. He was unwittingly destabilizing the very culture he sought to preserve. Behind the outsider's mask was a man who believed he could buy his way into a secret world, failing to understand that some secrets are protected by a wall that no amount of Rockefeller money can breach. As 1961 drew to a close, the political tension between the Netherlands and Indonesia reached a breaking point. Sukarno's "Crush Malaysia" and "Liberate West Irian" speeches were inciting a fervor that threatened all Westerners in the region. The Dutch began a secret evacuation of non-essential personnel. Michael, blinded by his success and his status, refused to leave. He felt he was on the verge of a breakthrough, a discovery that would finally earn him his father's unqualified respect. He had shed the gilded cradle, but he had replaced it with a mask of invulnerability that was about to be shattered by a mechanical failure and a 22-hour swim into the heart of a blood feud. By the late months of 1961, the political landscape of Netherlands New Guinea was a volatile powder keg of post-colonial friction and Cold War maneuvers. The Dutch administration, having lost the Indonesian archipelago in 1949, clung to this last Pacific outpost with a desperate, expensive tenacity. The annual cost of maintaining the territory was approximately 100 million guilders, roughly $28 million in 1961, or a staggering $300 million in 2026 purchasing power. This investment was increasingly viewed as a liability by the international community. United States President John F. Kennedy, wary of pushing Indonesian President Sukarno into the Soviet sphere of influence, began to withdraw American support for Dutch sovereignty. The Bunker Plan, a diplomatic roadmap named after American diplomat Ellsworth Bunker, was already being drafted in secret, essentially preparing to hand the territory to Indonesia. Michael Rockefeller was navigating a landscape where the map was literally dissolving beneath his feet. The technical apparatus of colonial control was centered in the capital of Hollandia, but on the Casuarina coast, authority was enforced by the politie and small mobile patrols of the Dutch Royal Army. These units were equipped with the M1 Garand rifle, a semi-automatic weapon developed in 1932 that had been the standard-issue rifle of the U.S. military during WW patents. The Garand was a masterpiece of mid-century engineering, utilizing a gas-operated piston and an 8-round en-bloc clip that ejected with a distinctive metallic ping. To the asthmat, who had not yet mastered the smelting of ore, the Garand was a lightning stick that could pierce the thickest ironwood shield. In 1958, this technical superiority was unleashed in a moment of catastrophic miscalculation that would seal Michael Rockefeller's fate. The central figure in this shadow history was Max Lapre, a Dutch controleur whose administrative philosophy was rooted in the rigid, uncompromising command and control structures of the early 20th century. In 1958, following reports of inter-village warfare between the Otjanep and the Omadasep, Lapre led a patrol into the heart of the swamp. His mission was to pacify the region and confiscate the weapons of war. However, the Asmat viewed this intervention not as a peacekeeping mission, but as a declaration of hostilities. When the warriors of Otjanep confronted the patrol, Lapre ordered his men to fire. 5 high-ranking village leaders, including the revered headman Ajam, were killed instantly. In Asmat cosmology, a death by violence creates a spiritual vacuum that can only be filled by a reciprocal death. The debt of blood was recorded by the village elders, not in ink, but in the collective memory of the Jew. Michael Rockefeller's presence in the region 3 years later was a logistical irony. He utilized Dutch transport, carried Dutch permits, and was often accompanied by Dutch officials. To the people of Otjanep, the distinction between a Rockefeller and a Lapre was non-existent. They were both Tuan, representatives of the white-skinned world that had disrupted the sacred balance of their lives. While Michael was writing home about the extraordinary friendliness of the locals, he was actually being monitored by a society that viewed him as the ultimate currency for spiritual restitution. The 1961 Dutch administrative budget for the Asmat region had allocated $15,000, $160,000 today, for civilian education. But it had neglected to account for the deep-seated resentment brewing in the mud-walled villages. The archive records of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs reveal a growing paranoia during this period. Secret cables from Hollandia to The Hague warned of increased ritual activity and the resumption of clandestine headhunting raids. The Dutch were losing their grip on the narrative. The shadow of colonialism was not just a metaphorical concept. It was a tangible presence in the form of Indonesian paratroopers who began infiltrating the coast in late 1961 as part of Operation Trikora. Michael was operating in a combat zone where the enemies were invisible. Indonesian saboteurs on one side and an aggrieved indigenous population on the other. He remained insulated by his name, a Rockefeller in a world where names were about to be replaced by numbers in a ledger of loss. By mid-November, the humidity reached a breaking point, signaling the onset of the monsoon. The Dutch were preoccupied with the evacuation of women and children from the more remote outposts. In the boardrooms of the Standard Oil heirs, the focus was on the upcoming 1962 fiscal quarter. No one was looking at the small, village-level geopolitics of the Casuarina coast. Michael's decision to travel toward Otjanep on November 17th was a catastrophic failure of intelligence. He was not just entering a village, he was entering a crime scene where the evidence was still fresh, and the judge, jury, and executioner were waiting for a sign from the ancestors. The village of Otjanep sits at the confluence of several tidal rivers, a labyrinthine geography where the land is indistinguishable from the water for 6 hours a day. In 1961, Otjanep was the largest and most militant of the Asmat settlements, housing nearly 1,000 people across several dozen communal structures. The architecture of the village was a testament to survival in an amphibious environment. Each house was elevated on 4-meter pilings to escape the king tides. The primary social engine of the village was the Bishi ritual, a complex cycle of mourning and revenge. When Michael Rockefeller arrived to collect Bishi poles, he was inadvertently participating in a ceremony of death. The poles were not mere sculptures. They were spiritual accounts receivable. Every figure carved into the wood represented a person whose death had not yet been avenged. The dark secret of Otjanep lay in its strictly enforced code of reciprocity. To the Asmat, there is no such thing as a natural death. Sickness, accidents, and even crocodile attacks are viewed as the result of sorcery or ancestral displeasure caused by an unpaid blood debt. The 1958 massacre by Max Lapre had left a massive deficit in the village's spiritual ledger. For 3 years, the spirits of Ajam and the other fallen leaders were believed to be wandering the Sago swamps, unable to cross into Safan, the realm of the ancestors. The only way to release them was to take the head of an equivalent enemy. In the hierarchical world of the Asmat, a white man of Michael's stature, a son of the governor, was the highest possible payment. Technically, the act of headhunting was a sophisticated surgical process. The weapon of choice was the endom, a dagger fashioned from the femur of a flightless bird, or more prestigiously, from a human humerus. These daggers were sharpened to a needle point and often decorated with the seeds of the quas lacrima Jobi, Job's tears. Once a victim was neutralized, the head was removed using a bamboo knife, a tool capable of a cleaner incision than most steel blades due to the high silica content in the bamboo skin. The cranium was then prepared. The brains were extracted through the foramen magnum, and the skin was cured. This was not a mindless act of violence. It was a technical necessity for the preservation of the community's cosmic health. Michael Rockefeller, with his Harvard-trained mind, viewed these artifacts as art, missing the reality that they were the functional hardware of a theological justice system. The archive curiosities of the 1960s show that several Catholic missionaries, including Father Hubertus von Peij and Father Cornelius van Kessel, had heard rumors of the Rockefeller sacrifice shortly after Michael disappeared. Their reports long suppressed by both the Dutch government and the Rockefeller family to avoid scandal, detailed specific accounts of the event. According to these secret testimonies, Michael had washed ashore near Otjanep, exhausted and vulnerable. He was met by a group of men led by a warrior named Finn. Finn was the brother of one of the men killed by Lapre in 1958. In the logic of the Asmat, Michael's arrival was not a coincidence. It was a gift from the ancestors to settle the debt. The secondary characters in this tragedy were the silent witnesses, the villagers who watched as the golden ghost was brought into the Jeu. Anthropology professor Karl Hoffman, who spent years investigating the case, noted that the villagers of Otjanep maintained a conspiracy of silence for decades. This silence was reinforced by the fear of colonial reprisal. If the Dutch, or later the Indonesians, discovered that a Rockefeller had been murdered, the entire village would likely be razed. The cost of a human life in the Casuarina coast was zero in terms of global economics, but in the spiritual economy of Otjanep, Michael Rockefeller's life was worth the restoration of an entire culture's honor. As Michael was led from the mudbanks toward the village center, he was stripped of his Western identity. His Nikon camera, his fuel cans, and his clothing, the artifacts of a multi-billion-dollar civilization, were discarded as useless trash. He was reduced to his biological essence. The secret was not that he had drowned or been eaten by sharks. The secret was that he had been processed by the very culture he sought to document. Dream. The foreshadowing was hidden in his own journals. Michael had once written that the Asmat were the most fascinating people on earth. He was about to find out exactly how fascinating their pursuit of balance could be. When the teletype machines at the Dutch Administrative Center in Hollandia began chattering on the evening of November 19, 1961, the message sent a shockwave through the global diplomatic corps. Michael Rockefeller was missing. The news reached Nelson Rockefeller at his estate in New York via a secure military line. His reaction was not that of a grieving father, but of a supreme commander. Within hours, the Rockefeller family's private logistical machine was integrated into the Dutch military apparatus. This was the birth of the billion-dollar search, a rescue operation that, when adjusted for 2026 purchasing power, remains one of the most expensive private public searches in maritime history. The immediate mobilization cost exceeded $1 million in 1961 currency, approximately $10, $5 million today, covering fuel, aircraft maintenance, and the suspension of standard colonial operations. The technical spearhead of the search involved the Lockheed P-2 Neptune, a long-range maritime patrol aircraft. The P-2 was a marvel of Cold War surveillance, equipped with APS-20 search radar and magnetic anomaly detectors. Its twin Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines produced 3,700 horsepower each, allowing the plane to loiter over the Arafura Sea for up to 10 hours. However, the radar tech of 1961 was designed to detect metal hulls, not a single human head bobbing in a silt-heavy sea. The Dutch Navy deployed the destroyer HNLMS Overijssel, a 2,500-ton vessel capable of 36 knots. The daily operating cost of a Dutch destroyer in 1961 was roughly $8,000, equivalent to $84,000 today. Despite this firepower, the searchers were fighting a losing battle against the geography. The Casuarina coast is a fractal of 10,000 square miles of tidal mud and dense canopy that swallows heat signatures and radio waves alike. Nelson Rockefeller arrived in Biak, New Guinea on November 22nd, accompanied by Michael's twin sister Mary. They traveled in a chartered Boeing 707, the first successful commercial jetliner. The 707 was the pinnacle of mid-century prestige, featuring a pressurized cabin and a cruising speed of 600 km/h, effectively shrinking the globe for those who could afford the $200 round-trip fare, $12,600 today. Nelson's presence transformed the search into a geopolitical event. He occupied a suite at the Hotel Rietveld, which was quickly converted into a high-tech command center with direct radio links to The Hague and Washington, D.C. Secondary characters in this drama included Admiral Reeser, the commander of Dutch forces in New Guinea, who found himself in the impossible position of managing a war alert against Indonesia while hosting a grieving American dynast and a swarm of over 100 international journalists. The macro context of the search was fraught with colonial tension. Indonesian President Sukarno saw the massive Western presence as a provocation. While Dutch P-2 Neptune searched for Michael, Indonesian Soviet-made Tu-16 Badger bombers were conducting reconnaissance flights nearby. The search was a logistical nightmare. Jet fuel, avtur, had to be shipped in from Singapore at a cost of 0.15 per gallon. $1.58 today, but the sheer volume required for the 24-hour air cover exhausted the colonial reserves within days. The Rockefeller family offered private rewards of tens of thousands of dollars to any local who could provide information, creating a secondary economic distortion. Villages that had never seen a dollar bill were suddenly presented with the equivalent of a century's worth of wages for a single clue. Archive curiosities from the Rietveld Command Center describe Nelson Rockefeller's eerie composure. He spent his nights reviewing aerial reconnaissance photos through a stereoscopic viewer, a device used by WW-20's intelligence officers to identify camouflaged targets. He was looking for 2 red jerry cans. By November 24th, the search area had expanded to 30,000 square miles. The Dutch government, under immense pressure, deployed 5,000 troops to conduct a ground search of the swamps. This maneuver was technically impossible. The mud was so deep that a soldier in full gear would sink to his waist in minutes. The search was transitioning from a rescue mission to a symbolic performance of Western power. As the days bled into a week, the optimism of the press corps evaporated. The harsh reality of the Arafura currents, which can move at 5 knots during a spring tide, meant that if Michael hadn't reached the shore within the first 24 hours, he was likely 200 miles out in the Indian Ocean. The Rockefeller family, however, refused to concede. They were used to a world where money solved every problem, where every obstacle was eventually dismantled by capital. But the sea and the jungle remained indifferent. The billion-dollar search had found nothing but the limits of the Rockefeller empire. The search was officially called off on November 28th. But for Nelson, the investigation would continue in the shadows for decades. The physical dissolution of Michael Rockefeller began the moment he surrendered his body to the Arafura Sea. To understand the 22-hour swim, one must analyze the biomechanics of survival in a tropical marine environment. Michael was 23, in peak physical condition, but he was facing a caloric deficit and the onset of stage 1 hypothermia. Even in 28 degrees, 82 degrees in water, the human body loses heat 25 times faster than in air. Over 20 hours, his core temperature would have dropped toward the clinical fatigue threshold of 35 degrees, 95 degrees. His primary survival tools were 2 18-liter polyethylene jerry cans. These containers, made by the blow molding process introduced in the late 1950s, provided approximately 36 kilograms of buoyancy when empty. By lashing them to his waist with a cotton belt, Michael created a makeshift outrigger, but it also created massive hydrodynamic drag. The tides of the Casuarina coast are a complex interaction of the Pacific and Indian Ocean water masses. On the morning of November 18th, Michael was caught in a flood tide that should have pushed him toward the shore, but a powerful cross-current known as the West New Guinea Current acted as a conveyor belt, dragging him parallel to the coast. He was swimming through a biological soup of suspended silt and microplastics. Every stroke required the activation of his latissimus dorsi and deltoids, burning roughly 400 to 600 calories per hour. Without a source of fresh water, his kidneys began to struggle with the rising sodium levels in his blood, a condition known as hypernatremia, leading to the first stages of delirium and visual hallucinations. As night fell over the Pacific, Michael was immersed in total darkness. The Arafura Sea is bioluminescent. Every movement of his limbs would have triggered a green-blue glow from dinoflagellates, making him a beacon for the apex predators of the region. The saltwater crocodile, Crocodilus porosus, is a sit-and-wait predator that utilizes sensory pits along its jaw to detect the low-frequency vibrations of a struggling swimmer. Furthermore, the tiger sharks, Galeocerdo cuvier of the region, are nocturnal hunters. Michael's survival during these dark hours was a statistical anomaly. By 3 a.m., his muscle glycogen stores would have been entirely depleted, forcing his body into ketosis, burning fat and eventually muscle tissue to maintain his heart rate. At dawn on November 18th, the shore finally became visible. It was not a beach, but a wall of rhizophora mangroves, a chaotic mesh of prop roots that act as a natural fortress. This is where the technical layer of the swim meets the historical layer of vengeance. Michael reached a mud bank near the mouth of the Utah River, just miles from the village of Otjanep. He was found not by a rescue team, but by the secondary characters of this tragedy. A group of Otjanep warriors in 3 dugout canoes. Among them were men like Finn and Pep, who had witnessed the 1958 massacre. According to later testimonies, Michael was so exhausted he could not stand. He was a white ghost caked in salt and mud, clutching his plastic cans like religious icons. The archived curiosities of the Dutch investigation include a detail often overlooked. The warriors found Michael's glasses. Michael was severely myopic, nearsighted. Without his corrective lenses, which were lost in the surf, the warriors approaching him would have appeared as blurred, dark shapes, ancestral spirits emerging from the green haze. For the men of Otjanep, the sight of a Rockefeller, the ultimate Tuwan, helpless and broken on their land, was the fulfillment of a prophecy. The specific dark secret of this encounter was that the warriors did not kill him out of hunger or random malice. They engaged in a ritualized debate. Some argued he should be returned for a reward. Others, led by the elder Finn, argued that his life was the only thing that could balance the scales for the 5 leaders killed by the Dutch. Michael Rockefeller's last moments were not those of a billionaire's son, but of a man who had successfully crossed the impossible threshold of the sea, only to find that the land was more dangerous than the water. He had survived 22 hours of salt, sharks, and currents through sheer willpower, a trait that was the hallmark of the Rockefeller dynasty. But as the warriors stepped out of their canoes and onto the mudbank, Michael realized that his first peak of cultural immersion was about to become his final descent. He had reached the shore, but he had arrived at the wrong moment in history. The blood debt of 1958 was about to be settled in the mud of the Utah River. The termination of Michael Rockefeller's life was not a chaotic event, but a highly regulated judicial procedure within the Asmat theological framework. According to the investigation led by Father Hubertus von Peitsch and corroborated decades later by investigative journalist Karl Hoffman, Michael was brought to the village of Otjanep in the late afternoon of November 18, 1961. The technical execution was performed near a small creek, away from the prying eyes of the women and children. In the Asmat world, the ritual taking of a head is a restorative act of soul balance. The specific tools utilized were the endom, a dagger fashioned from the femur of a cassowary bird sharpened to a needle point, and a bamboo knife. The silica-rich skin of the Schizostachium bamboo, when split, creates an edge that is molecularly sharper than a surgical scalpel. This tool allowed for the precise removal of the head at the 3rd cervical vertebra, a process that required an intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The technical layer of the processing followed a strict protocol. Once the head was removed, it was not merely a trophy. It was a biological vessel that needed to be neutralized. The brain, viewed as the seat of the victim's power, was extracted through the foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull. This was typically achieved by enlarging the hole with a stone adze and using a carved wooden spatula to remove the tissue. The skull was then scorched to remove the flesh and skin, and later polished with a mixture of sand and gray volcanic ash. In Michael's case, his remains were subjected to the final apotheosis. His bones were cleaned and distributed among the village's high-ranking warriors. The humerus and femur bones were often repurposed into lime containers or additional daggers, ensuring that the strength of the Golden Ghost remained physically integrated into the village's defense. The political context of this act was the blood debt of 1958. The men who participated in the killing, identified in Dutch mission reports as Finn, Pep, and Ajim, were not acting out of personal malice. They were the legal executors of a tribal sentence. Finn, in particular, was the brother of a man killed by Max Lapre's patrol. By taking Michael's life, he was fulfilling the hutang dara, blood debt, a concept that exists across the Indonesian archipelago but reaches its most literal form in the Casuarina coast. To the Asmat, Michael was the perfect surrogate for the Dutch government. He arrived from the sea, he possessed immense material wealth, and he was clearly a chief among his own kind. His death was the only currency that could close the spiritual ledger opened by Lapre's rifles 3 years prior. The curiosities of the ritual included the disposition of Michael's clothing. His khaki shorts and undershirt, mass-produced American textiles of the early 1960s, were reportedly burned as they were seen as spirit-contaminated items. However, his steel-framed glasses and his 2 red jerry cans were kept for a time as objects of intense curiosity. The jerry cans, made of high-density polyethylene, were indestructible by Asmat standards. They became symbols of the cargo cult mentality, objects of power from a world that the Asmat were only beginning to understand. The Nikon F camera was reportedly thrown into the river, its sophisticated Japanese optics and titanium shutter becoming part of the silt, a technical marvel rendered useless in a world governed by the spirits of the ancestors. The secondary characters in this final act were the silent majority of Otjanep. In 1961, the village was a closed system. The elders maintained a conspiracy of silence that would last for over 50 years. When the Dutch search parties eventually arrived at the village, they were met with blank stares and a complete lack of evidence. The villagers had hidden the bones and the ritual items deep within the sago swamps. The cost of this silence was a collective psychological weight. Many of the warriors involved reportedly died within years, which the village attributed to the backlash of killing such a powerful spirit. The Rockefeller family's wealth, which could influence the UN and the US State Department, found itself completely neutralized by the omerta of a mud-walled village in New Guinea. By the time the sun set on November 18th, Michael Rockefeller had ceased to be an individual and had become an ancestor. His transition from the gilded cradle to the sacred soil was complete. He had sought the soul of the humanity in his travels, and he had found it in its most raw, unforgiving form. The 22-hour swim was the crucible, and the village of Otjanep was the altar. In the heart of Manhattan, the Rockefeller family was still authorizing cables to be sent to embassies. In the heart of the jungle, the only cables that mattered were the rattan vines used to bind the remains of a man who had finally escaped his name. The aftermath of Michael Rockefeller's disappearance was marked by a massive, multi-decade effort to sanitize the narrative and institutionalize his loss. In 1962, the geopolitical map was redrawn as the Dutch officially ceded Western New Guinea to the United Nations, which then transferred it to Indonesia under the New York Agreement. The territory became Irian Jaya, and the village of Otjanep was brought under the administration of the Indonesian military, TNI. The Dutch archives on the Rockefeller disappearance were classified for decades, effectively burying the reports of Father von Paich and the local testimonies of the sacrifice. Nelson Rockefeller, ever the architect of image, focused his grief into the construction of a permanent monument to his son's obsession. The Michael C. Rockefeller Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MET. The technical engineering of the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing is a masterclass in museum architecture and environmental control. Opened in 1982, the 30,000-square-foot space was designed by the firm Roche Dinkeloo. It features a massive sloped glass wall, the curtain wall, that overlooks Central Park, allowing the light of New York to fall upon the Bisci poles Michael had died to collect. The climate within the wing is strictly regulated to 20 degrees per nearly 70 degrees, with 50% relative humidity, a technical necessity to prevent the organic asmat fibers from desiccating and shattering. The cost of the wing's construction and endowment exceeded $10 million in 1982 currency, the equivalent of $32 million in 2026. Here, the artifacts Michael traded for with steel axes are preserved with the same meticulous care as the Egyptian temple of Dendur. The legacy of the Standard Oil fortune continued to evolve, even as Michael's seat at the family table remained vacant. Nelson Rockefeller went on to serve as the Vice President of the United States under Gerald Ford in 1974, a political peak Michael never lived to see. The Rockefeller family's net worth continued its diversification, moving from petroleum into high-growth technology and global venture capital. By 2026, the aggregate wealth of the Rockefeller descendants, managed through hundreds of trusts and foundations, remains an influential force in global philanthropy. Yet the disappearance of Michael remains the family's only unsolvable problem, a deficit that no amount of compound interest could ever close. Mary Rockefeller, Michael's twin, spent her life as an advocate for the arts, but she rarely spoke of the tragedy, maintaining a private distance from the jungle that claimed her other half. The macro context of the 21st century has seen the Asmat region undergo a violent and incomplete modernization. The Indonesian government has banned headhunting and ritual warfare, replacing the Bischi ceremonies with government-sponsored cultural festivals designed for tourism. The village of Otjanep is no longer a fortress of secrecy. It is a point on a map for adventure travelers and anthropologists. Yet the dark secret remains. In 2014, when Carl Hoffman visited the village, he found that the older men still remembered the white man from the sea. They spoke of him in hushed tones as a spirit who had been incorporated into their lineage. The physical ruins of Michael's expedition, the submerged canoe, the lost camera have long been reclaimed by the mangrove roots, which grow at a rate of 10 to 15 centimeters per year, slowly erasing the industrial evidence of his presence. Archive curiosities suggest that the Rockefeller family may have quietly recovered Michael's remains in the late 1960s. Rumors of a private burial at the Pocantico Hills estate have persisted for years, though the family has never confirmed them. This ambiguity serves a dual purpose. It maintains the mystery that keeps Michael's collection valuable while shielding the family from the brutal reality of his end. The artifacts in the Met are now valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. A single Bischi pole from Michael's original collection could fetch $5 million at a 2026 Sotheby's auction. The conversion of value is complete. Michael's physical body was lost, but his cultural capital has been immortalized in the most prestigious real estate in Manhattan. The final act of the Rockefeller saga is a meditation on the vanity of possession. Michael Rockefeller set out to capture the primal world with his Nikon camera and his father's money, only to find that the primal world possessed its own ruthless logic of acquisition. Today, the tourists who walk through the Michael C. Rockefeller wing at the Met see only the beauty of the carvings. They do not see the blood debt of 1958, the 22-hour swim through shark-infested waters, or the bamboo knife that settled the score. The museum is a mausoleum of wood and fiber, a monument to a man who thought he could buy the soul of a culture and ended up paying with his own.